Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. Some warnings arrive early. Others arrive exactly when they can no longer save you. There's a strange moment that happens before every collapse, and it's almost never loud. It doesn't come with alarms, sirens, or dramatic music. It comes with confidence. People are usually calm right before things go wrong. They're joking. They're relaxed. They're certain they still have time. That's the part no one likes to admit. Here's a fact that makes people uncomfortable. Most irreversible mistakes aren't made in ignorance. They're made after information was available, patterns were visible, and subtle warnings were already ignored. Psychologists call it commitment bias. Once people emotionally invest in a decision, they stop listening, even when evidence starts tapping them on the shoulder. Not kicking the door down, just tapping. And that's where he enters the story. Not as a hero, not as a villain. Just someone who saw the trajectory early and understood something most people learn too late. Warnings only work when the listener still respects consequences. By the time people start begging for a warning, they're not looking for truth anymore. They're looking for a miracle with good timing. There's also a quiet comedy in it, if you look closely. Humans have an incredible talent for ignoring every sign on the road, driving past every flashing light, then rolling down the window at the crash site to ask for directions. Very sincere, very confident, slightly too late. So when they finally turned to him, voices urgent, eyes wide, hoping for one last sentence to save them from the momentum they had already built, he didn't panic. He didn't lecture. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled. Not because he was cruel, not because he enjoyed it, but because some moments don't need drama, only honesty. And honesty, when delayed long enough, sounds exactly like two words no one wants to hear. Too late. Number 1. He stopped trying to save people the moment he realized they were invested in their own downfall. There comes a point where effort turns into waste, and concern quietly becomes enablement. He didn't wake up one day cold or detached. It happened slowly after watching the same patterns repeat with different excuses. Every time he spoke, people nodded, agreed, even thanked him, and then walked straight back into the very thing they claimed they wanted to escape. That's when it became clear. They weren't confused. They were committed. Some people build emotional homes inside their bad decisions. They decorate them with reasons, defend them with passion, and attack anyone who threatens to tear them down. When he tried to warn them, it wasn't received as help. It was treated as interference. Not because he was wrong, but because being right would force change. And change is expensive when you've already paid so much to stay the same. He noticed something unsettling. The more accurate his warnings became, the more resistance he faced. Logic bounced off. Evidence got rebranded as negativity. Accountability was called judgment. At that point, speaking didn't make him wise. It made him useful in the wrong way. His words became tools they used to argue better, justify longer, and fail with more confidence. Saving someone only works when they want to be saved. Otherwise, all you're doing is helping them drag their habits forward. He realized that every attempt to pull them back was actually pushing him deeper into their chaos. Their refusal to change began demanding that he shrink, repeat himself, soften his tone, and eventually doubt what he already knew. So he stopped. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. You can't rescue people who are emotionally loyal to what's destroying them. You can't warn someone who hears warnings as threats to their identity, and you definitely can't protect adults from choices they've already defended in their own mind. His silence wasn't abandonment. It was respect for himself and for reality. When someone insists on walking toward the edge, the most honest thing you can do is step back and let gravity finish the conversation. Number 2. They asked for a warning because it would shift responsibility off their shoulders. By the time they came asking, the decision had already been made. What they wanted wasn't guidance, it was insurance. A warning would give them something to lean on later, something to point at when things went wrong. If he spoke, they could say they listened. If they ignored him, they could still claim they tried. Either way, the weight of the outcome wouldn't sit fully on them. That's how responsibility gets diluted. Not removed, just shared enough to feel lighter. People are remarkably skilled at outsourcing guilt. They don't want to carry the full cost of their choices, so they look for witnesses, advisors, and voices of authority to stand beside them. That way, failure becomes a group effort instead of a personal reckoning. He saw this pattern clearly. Every time he warned someone in the past, his words were later repurposed. If things went well, his role was forgotten. If things collapsed, suddenly his warning became part of the story. "We knew," they would say. "We were warned." As if awareness alone deserved partial credit. But awareness without action is just decoration. It looks responsible on the surface while leaving behavior untouched. A warning in that moment would not have changed direction. It would have softened the fall by spreading the blame. And he refused to be used that way. There's a strange comfort in being warned. It creates the illusion of control. People feel safer knowing someone smarter or more experienced has spoken, even if they have no intention of adjusting course. The warning becomes emotional padding, not a turning point. He smiled because he understood the trick. Once he spoke, he would be tied to the outcome. Their failure would carry his fingerprints, even if he never touched the decision itself. Staying silent forced a clean line between choice and consequence. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is not participate in someone else's escape from accountability. Letting them own the outcome fully is harsh, but it's honest. And honesty, unlike warnings given too late, doesn't pretend to save anyone. Number 3. He recognized that timing matters more than truth. Truth is a curious thing. On its own, it has power, but only if it arrives when someone is ready to receive it. He had learned that early truths are often wasted truths. When he spoke too soon, people either ignored him or reshaped his words into something comforting. They didn't reject the truth. They rejected the disruption it demanded. Timing, he realized, dictated whether his insight could create change or simply vanish into background noise. There's a strange irony in this. The very people who begged for a warning were already past the point where any words could alter their path. They wanted validation, not intervention, because their choices were emotionally cemented. A warning now would only be noise, like shouting over a river. The lesson had to arrive when it could no longer be avoided, when reality itself made listening unavoidable. That moment is rare, and it carries weight no argument or logic can match. He also understood that truth delivered too late isn't failure, it's inevitability. People often assume that if a warning comes after the fact, it's useless. But timing transforms the same words into prophecy. Delivered too early, truth can be ignored. Delivered too late, it becomes undeniable. He smiled at this because he knew that controlling timing was more powerful than controlling content. A single well-timed moment could communicate more than 100 ignored warnings ever could. The beauty and cruelty of timing is that it exposes character. It separates those who hear only what comforts them from those who are forced to confront themselves. It strips away excuses and illusions, leaving clarity where before there was denial. He didn't speak because the moment hadn't arrived. He waited, not out of malice, but out of understanding that the universe often teaches better than any mouth can. In the end, timing doesn't just matter. It defines whether truth lands as a seed, a warning, or a hammer. He smiled, knowing that the right moment, no matter how late, would be clearer, sharper, and far more unforgettable than anything he could have said earlier. Number 4. They mistook his past patience for permanent availability. People have a way of assuming that someone's patience is endless, that kindness is infinite, and that wisdom is always on standby. He had seen it before, the same faces, the same questions, the same missteps, all expecting him to swoop in and untangle the consequences for them. Over time, he realized that patience is often mistaken for permission, and silence for consent. Every past intervention had been stored in their minds as a guarantee that he would always be there, always explaining, always guiding, no matter how many times they ignored the signs. That assumption is dangerous, both for them and for him. They relied not on learning, but on him catching them when they fell, on smoothing the edges of their mistakes, on repeating truths they already heard until the words lost meaning. Patience became a crutch for their complacency. They weren't asking for insight, they were asking for safety nets he had no obligation to provide. His previous willingness to step in had been taken as a permanent contract, one they could exploit without consequence. He noticed how predictable the pattern was. The more he delayed, the more urgent their pleas became. The louder they begged, the more certain he became that his past patience had been misread as loyalty to their choices rather than respect for their growth. Each plea revealed their dependence, their inability to trust themselves, and their subtle expectation that someone else should bear the cost of their avoidance. So he stopped. Not harshly, not dramatically. He just stopped being their safety net. He understood that constant availability doesn't teach responsibility. It fosters reliance. People only grow when they meet the consequences of ignoring guidance. By stepping back, he refused to be the invisible hand that corrected every misstep, the constant echo that softened every truth. His silence wasn't abandonment. It was a boundary, a lesson in itself. When patience is mistaken for permanence, reality eventually intervenes. And when it does, there's no one left to catch them except themselves. Number 5. He understood that some lessons must be experienced, not explained. There's a kind of truth that no words can carry, a lesson that can't be taught with phrases or warnings. He understood this better than most. He had watched people nod, take notes, and swear they would act differently, only to repeat the exact same mistakes days, weeks, or months later. Explanations were useful for awareness, but awareness alone doesn't change behavior. Real learning requires the full weight of consequence, the kind that seeps in only when someone has walked through the fire themselves. He noticed that when he tried to explain too much, his words became walls, barriers that allowed people to feel prepared without being accountable. They would nod politely, even thank him, all while remaining firmly on the path that led to failure. Words were cheap, but experience was exacting. Pain, embarrassment, disappointment, and sudden clarity. They were the teachers no lecture could replace. People often want a shortcut, a speech, a warning delivered just right, hoping to dodge the inevitable. He knew those shortcuts were illusions, so he let things unfold. He didn't intervene, because intervention often interrupts the lesson. He didn't argue, plead, or warn, because every additional word risked giving them a false sense of control. By standing back, he allowed the natural consequences to arrive on their own timetable, knowing that only through experiencing the results could they truly internalize the truth. There's a brutal honesty in this method. Experience doesn't negotiate. It doesn't sugarcoat. It leaves no room for excuses. It demands recognition. He smiled quietly because this understanding freed him from frustration. Silence became a form of respect, for the process, for the inevitability, and even for the people themselves. Some lessons, he knew, must strike at the core to be understood. Talking about them wouldn't do it justice. They had to live it, stumble through it, and eventually confront the reality they had spent so long avoiding. That's where real insight lives, not in explanations, but in the experience that can't be borrowed, bargained for, or postponed. Number 6, they weren't asking him to warn them, they were asking him to reassure them. By the time they came running, voices frantic and eyes wide, it wasn't guidance they sought. It wasn't insight or clarity. They wanted comfort, a soft landing, someone to tell them it would be okay, so they could keep walking the path they had already chosen. Humans have an uncanny ability to confuse urgency with danger and fear with wisdom. They begged for warnings, but what they truly craved was permission to continue without consequence. He could see it immediately in the way they spoke, in the tension behind their words. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking validation. Every plea, every shaky breath, every desperate insistence was a subtle request to soften reality, to sugarcoat the inevitable. They wanted him to take the edge off their anxiety, not sharpen their awareness. A warning would force reflection, force change, force responsibility. Reassurance, on the other hand, keeps the narrative comfortable, keeps the illusions intact. That's where the smile came in. Not cruelty, not disdain, just recognition. He understood that giving them reassurance would be dishonest. It would be a form of complicity, a quiet participation in their delusion. He refused to dilute the weight of consequence. He understood that the moment required clarity, not comfort, and that sometimes the kindest act is to step back and let reality speak for itself. They wanted his words to be soft, to serve as a shield against what they didn't want to face. Instead, he chose silence. His silence was louder than anything he could have said, because it carried honesty, finality, and the unspoken truth that life doesn't bend to our desire for comfort. There is no approval in consequence, no safety net in inevitability, and no substitute for facing what has already been set in motion. In the end, they learned, as they always do, that reassurance is a temporary illusion. Real understanding comes only when the truth, unchecked and unsoftened, hits with full force. And he smiled because he had no interest in being a part of their illusions. Number 7. He realized that repeated warnings eventually lose their authority. There's a limit to how many times someone can be told what's coming before the words themselves lose meaning. He had seen it too often. The more he cautioned, the more his warnings became background noise, like static on a radio that people stop hearing without even noticing. Each repetition chipped away at the urgency, the weight, the impact. People start tuning out, not because the danger isn't real, but because they've become accustomed to hearing it and continuing anyway. Warnings carry power only when they are rare, precise, and taken seriously. When repeated endlessly, they become predictable, and predictability breeds complacency. People hear the same phrases over and over, and instead of listening, they start rehearsing polite responses, or even worse, using the warnings to justify staying on course. It's the irony of foresight. The more someone tries to prevent disaster by speaking out, the more their voice can be reduced to white noise. He understood that authority and guidance doesn't live in volume or frequency. It lives in timing, clarity, and consequence. Once people sense that a warning is always available, it loses its edge. The moment you say, "Watch out," for the 100th time, the listener hears, "Everything's fine," instead. Authority, like respect, is earned in moments that demand attention. Too much repetition erodes both. That's why he stopped. Not because he didn't care, but because he realized that speaking again would not save anyone. It would only make the truth easier to ignore. Silence, in its starkness, carries more force than words repeated to the point of exhaustion. It forces people to confront patterns they have been avoiding, to recognize the gravity of what's coming, and to face the consequences without a safety net of repeated assurances. In the end, repeated warnings can only dilute reality. By stepping back, he preserved the weight of the truth, letting the inevitability speak louder than any words ever could. When the moment arrived, it landed sharp, undeniable and unforgettable, proof that authority is strongest when it is scarce, not constant. Number 8. They had already decided, and they just wanted permission. By the time they turned to him, desperate for a warning, the path they were on had already been chosen. Every hesitation, every doubt, every fleeting thought of change had been dismissed long ago. What they were really seeking wasn't guidance, it was confirmation. They wanted him to nod, to give them the invisible stamp that made their decision feel safe, justified, and unavoidable. Humans have a remarkable ability to cloak stubbornness in urgency, and he could see it clearly. People rarely change course because someone speaks. Change requires something more uncomfortable than words. Confrontation with themselves, acknowledgement of what they're risking, and the courage to abandon the story they've been telling themselves. By the time they came begging for a warning, they weren't looking for clarity. They were looking for approval. They wanted someone to witness their choice and quietly say, "Go ahead, you're fine," even though they weren't. He smiled because he understood the subtle truth. No warning could alter the trajectory they had cemented with emotion and habit. Their pleas were performative, a final act in a play they had written for themselves. Every question, every frantic tone, was not curiosity. It was a subtle manipulation, an attempt to outsource guilt and make someone else a co-author of a decision that was already fully theirs. He didn't speak because speaking would give weight to a path they had already chosen, and he refused to participate in the illusion of control. Silence became a mirror, reflecting back the reality they had been avoiding. They had decided, and now they had to live with it. In the end, his silence was brutal, but it was honest. Decisions made with full awareness demand ownership. By refusing to give them permission, he preserved the integrity of consequences, leaving them to confront the results of choices they had already made. Sometimes, the clearest lesson is the one that cannot be sanctioned, approved, or softened. It is lived, endured, and finally understood. Number 9. He knew that saving them would cost him more than losing them. There comes a point when trying to protect someone from their own choices starts to take a toll, not on them, but on you. Every warning, every piece of advice, every attempt to redirect them drained his energy, clarity, and even his sense of self. He had realized over time that being the safety net for people determined to fall is exhausting work, and the cost of continuing to intervene often outweighed any temporary relief it might provide. Losing them, letting them face the consequences, was cleaner, sharper, and ultimately more honest. People rarely understand the weight of this kind of involvement. When you constantly step in, you become responsible for outcomes that were never yours to carry. Your time is eaten, your patience tested, and your judgment stretched thin. They may call it guidance, but it quickly becomes entanglement. Every intervention requires compromise, and every compromise chips away at your principles. Saving them doesn't just help them, it chains you to their patterns, their denial, and their avoidance of responsibility. He recognized the subtle signs early, the repeated mistakes, the deflection of blame, the way warnings were politely noted and promptly ignored. Each act of saving them only reinforced the cycle. Instead of changing, they grew dependent, expecting his insight to fix what their own choices were breaking. The longer he tried, the more he invested in outcomes that were slipping further out of reach. Stepping back wasn't abandonment, it was protection of his time, energy, and mental clarity. By refusing to intervene, he preserved his own boundaries and integrity. Losing them in this context didn't feel like defeat. It felt inevitable, necessary, and even liberating. Sometimes the kindest act isn't to pull someone from the storm, but to allow them to experience it, fully and without interference. The cost of saving them can be invisible, but devastating, and the cost of letting go is often the only way to reclaim balance. He smiled, not out of cruelty, but because he finally understood that some losses protect more than they take. Number 10. They only valued his insight when fear finally caught up. People don't tend to appreciate wisdom until it's unavoidable. He had noticed the pattern too many times. His advice, his warnings, his observations were ignored, minimized, or politely nodded at when things were calm, convenient, or within comfort zones. People listen selectively, hearing only what aligns with their desire for reassurance or ease. But when fear arrives, sudden, sharp, undeniable, then his words gain weight, then his presence seems essential, then every ignored warning flashes like a neon sign they cannot turn away from. It's a strange, almost tragic reality. The same people who dismissed him when it mattered most would suddenly act as if he had been the only voice of reason all along. They reach for him frantically, hoping that he can somehow undo what they ignored, hoping that the wisdom they disregarded can reverse the momentum of consequences now barreling toward them. And in that moment, they don't just value his insight, they glorify it. They treat it like a lifeline, when in truth it was available all along, and they had chosen not to hold on to it. He smiled quietly at this. Not because he took pleasure in their panic, but because he understood the irony. Wisdom only has power when the recipient is ready to face reality. Fear, unlike calm reasoning, forces attention. It strips away excuses, rationalizations, and the illusion of control. The lessons he had tried to deliver early became obvious, undeniable, and unavoidable. The timing may have been inconvenient for them, but it was perfect for the lesson itself. He also understood a subtle truth about human nature. Appreciation after the fact is not the same as respect before it. When people value insight only when they are afraid, they are responding to survival instinct, not genuine understanding. That's why he didn't rush. That's why he waited. Fear, when it finally arrived, carried the clarity that words alone could never force. And in that clarity, his silence, his observation, and his prior warnings all finally found their weight. Too late, but unmistakably real. Number 11. He recognized that warnings can become a form of control. Words are powerful, but he knew that repeated warnings carry a subtle danger. They can create dependency, obligation, and even manipulation. When someone issues caution too often, they risk becoming less a guide and more a lever. People start listening, not because they want to learn or grow, but because they feel monitored, restrained, or subtly coerced. A warning can easily shift from being a tool of insight to a tool of influence, and he refused to let his voice become a chain. He had seen it happen countless times. Someone repeats a caution, then steps back to see if the listener obeys. If the advice is ignored, frustration rises. If it is followed, the advisor feels a fleeting sense of control. Both reactions distort the natural flow of responsibility. The warned begin to act out of obligation rather than understanding. Decisions are made to please, avoid criticism, or meet expectations, instead of being grounded in their own judgment. He realized this creates a dangerous dynamic, where the warning giver becomes a silent manipulator, and the warned lose their autonomy. He smiled because he understood the irony. The very act of trying to protect someone can unintentionally trap them in dependence. Over time, repeated intervention erodes self-trust, teaching people that consequences can be avoided if someone else anticipates them. That's not guidance. That's control disguised as care. By stepping back, he refused to participate in a pattern that rewarded avoidance and punished independence. Silence, in this sense, became liberation for both sides. He also saw the long-term effect. People who rely on warnings rarely develop the instinct to navigate danger themselves. They wait for signals, prompts, or advice, never learning to confront risk on their own. By withholding constant warnings, he allowed reality to teach what words could not. Personal responsibility has weight, and insight without action is meaningless. In the end, he stayed quiet because true guidance is not about bending someone's behavior. It's about letting them meet the world on their own terms. Control disguised as caution achieves nothing. Silence, when timed right, respects both freedom and consequence, and sometimes that is the most honest warning of all. Number 12. They confused access to him with entitlement to his wisdom. Just because someone is within reach doesn't mean they deserve your insight. He had learned this the hard way. People assumed that proximity, familiarity, or even past help gave them permanent rights to his guidance. They treated his knowledge like a commodity on demand, forgetting that wisdom isn't a utility. It's earned, respected, and shared selectively. They acted as if the door to his understanding was always open, and that he existed to hand it over whenever they felt like asking. This misconception is dangerous because it shifts the burden of responsibility. They wanted answers, shortcuts, and reassurance, all without the effort to understand, reflect, or act. They expected that his words alone could fix situations they had already complicated with their choices. And when his guidance wasn't given on their timetable, frustration would surface, often accompanied by a subtle sense of betrayal, as if his silence was an error on his part, rather than a boundary they had ignored. He recognized that this confusion is rooted in entitlement, not necessity. People want easy solutions, and they want them to come packaged with authority. They forget that insight carries weight, and weight demands attention and readiness. Giving wisdom freely to someone unprepared isn't generosity. It's dilution. It cheapens the lesson, and more importantly, it cheapens him. His knowledge was not a public utility to soothe comfort or validate poor decisions. It was a tool for those willing to engage, reflect, and take responsibility. So he withheld it when the moment didn't merit it. Silence became a form of honesty, a reminder that access does not equal entitlement. He let consequences speak louder than explanations. Those who truly needed understanding would recognize the value of his presence, not just the convenience of it. Those who thought knowledge was theirs for the taking would discover that wisdom is selective, and that its absence is often the most effective teacher. In the end, access without respect teaches nothing, but silence can teach everything. Number 13. He had already warned them, just not in the way they wanted. The truth about warnings is that they rarely come in the neat, dramatic form people expect. He had given them signals, nudges, small truths, and subtle indicators, all pointing to the direction they needed to turn. But people rarely notice a warning when it doesn't arrive wrapped in urgency, theatrics, or a perfectly timed lecture. They wanted him to stand in front of them and spell it out with flair, to make them uncomfortable enough to act. But life rarely hands lessons in that format. The reality is quieter, sharper, and far less forgiving than the warnings they demanded. He had been patient, consistent, and precise, but they filtered his words through their own desires. They heard what they wanted to hear, twisted phrases into reassurance, and overlooked what made them uneasy. The signals were there in his tone, in the patterns he highlighted, in the way he spoke about outcomes, but they ignored them because discomfort is easy to dismiss until it becomes unavoidable. Warnings lose their meaning when the listener's focus is on what they wish to believe rather than what is actually happening. That's why, when they came begging for him to warn them properly, he smiled. Not because he enjoyed their panic, but because he understood the bitter truth. The lessons had already been given, but they had been misread. He had done his part. The rest, the hard, undeniable consequences, was theirs to meet. Sometimes people act as if warnings are obligations for others to deliver, when in reality they are invitations to observe, reflect, and respond. His silence became the final signal. By not restating what had already been communicated in subtler ways, he forced reality to speak for itself. This is the lesson most people resist. No one can teach you the moment you are unwilling to hear it. No repetition, no dramatic speech, no proper warning can substitute for attention, discernment, and responsibility. When they finally understood, it was too late. Not because he hadn't warned them, but because they had been waiting for the warning that fit their comfort, rather than listening to the one that actually mattered. Number 14. His smile wasn't satisfaction. It was final clarity. When the moment arrived, he didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to lecture, warn, or justify. He smiled because he had reached a place beyond frustration, beyond hope, beyond expectation. What they wanted from him, last-minute guidance, a lifeline, reassurance, was irrelevant. He had already seen the pattern, already understood the trajectory, and already accepted the inevitability. His smile wasn't cruelty. It was the calm acknowledgement of a truth they were only just beginning to face. Final clarity is a rare thing. It comes when observation meets experience, when patience meets consequence, when awareness no longer has an audience to persuade. He understood that the universe has its own timing, and that the lessons that arrive too late are often the most unforgettable. Words fail at this stage because reality itself becomes the messenger. His smile carried all the understanding he had offered before, now compressed into a single moment that needed no explanation. It was sharper, purer, and far more instructive than anything he could have said. There's also a subtle elegance in this kind of silence. By stepping back, he preserved his integrity and let the inevitable unfold. The smile communicated what words never could, that consequences are impartial, that insight is wasted on those unwilling to act, and that clarity often comes dressed in discomfort. It carried the weight of observation, experience, and restraint all at once. It was the acknowledgement that some truths don't need to be voiced. They need only to be witnessed. He smiled because he had done everything he could do and had nothing more to give. The rest belonged to them. They would experience the impact of their choices fully, without mitigation, without hand-holding, and without excuse. And in that moment, his smile wasn't about them at all. It was about him, about the peace that comes when you stop trying to control outcomes that aren't yours, and accept the raw, unfiltered consequences of reality. Too late, clear, unavoidable, perfectly understood. The truth is simple, yet brutal. Warnings only work when they are heard, understood, and acted upon. People rarely fail because guidance wasn't available. They fail because they ignored it, misinterpreted it, or waited for it to arrive in the form they wanted. He didn't stop warning out of cruelty or indifference. He stopped because he understood something most never do. True clarity and responsibility can't be handed out like candy. They must be earned, experienced, and sometimes faced in silence. Every smile, every pause, every withheld word was a lesson in itself, teaching that timing, personal accountability, and self-awareness carry far more weight than any spoken warning ever could. We live in a world where everyone wants shortcuts, where people look for quick reassurances and external validation. But the reality doesn't bend to our comfort. Some lessons demand confrontation, Some consequences arrive whether we are ready or not, and some truths are only recognized when the moment is too late to avoid them. That's the power of observation, the weight of experience, and the undeniable impact of letting reality teach its own lessons. What he gave wasn't always what they wanted, but it was exactly what they needed. Silence, patience, and restraint often speak louder than 1,000 repeated warnings. So take this with you. Respect timing, honor responsibility, and understand that insight without action is meaningless. Learn to notice the signals before they become unavoidable, and don't wait for permission or reassurance to do what you already know is right. Some lessons only arrive when you've earned the clarity to face them, and some moments are unforgettable because they are unavoidable. If this message resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more hard-hitting truths that challenge the way you see the world. Like, comment, and share this video so others can experience the same clarity, and join the conversation where we break down reality, choice, and the lessons most people are too late to learn. Stay awakened, chosen ones.